Welcome back to True Asian Nightmare. I'm Kay. If the weight of today is still resting heavy on your chest, it's time to gently set it down. You don't need to carry those worries into the dark. Just close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let these true scary stories carry you away from the stress. As you settle in, please consider dropping a like and subscribing with the bell on. Doing this ensures there will always be another nightmare waiting for you every other night. Before the stories begin, I'd love to read in the comments where in the world you're resting right now and what time it is on your clock. It's a comforting thought to know we are sharing the same quiet, midnight hour together. Now pull your blankets up tight, let the room fade into total darkness, and let's get into our first true horror encounter of the night. I have been clean for about 4 or 5 years now, married with kids, but I was a complete idiot when I was a teenager, man. Like I got expelled halfway through 9th grade and told my folks I was done with school, so I just spent my days loitering at coffee shops and pool halls. I would literally beg my mom for 20,000 dong a day, barely $1, and I would even take these fake mercenary gigs where guys paid me $2 to wave a weapon and scream at someone down the alley just to scare them. Word got around and this heavy-hitting local boss kinda took a liking to me. He was loaded, ran a huge cockfighting farm, owned coffee shops, restaurants, and drove a flashy car. He started calling me Little Vince and basically tossed me a gig managing the night shift at his private motel. Honestly, calling it a motel is a massive overstatement because this place was basically a concrete block hidden at the end of a dirt road, and it definitely was not meant for tourists or normal families on vacation. It was a haven for the boss's underlings, a cheap spot for sketchy hookups, and most importantly, it was a safe zone for the local junkies to get high without the cops busting their doors down. The setup was incredibly depressing. I would show up at 9 p.m. to relieve the day guy, and I would just sit behind this rotting wooden reception desk that always smelled like cheap bleach mixed with stale cigarette smoke. There was no air conditioning in the lobby, just this rusty ceiling fan clicking and wobbling overhead, a tiny tube TV, and some spotty Wi-Fi to keep myself awake. The job itself was ridiculously easy, which is why I took it despite the creepy atmosphere. I did not have to ask for any identification or make anyone sign a guest book. The rooms were cheap, like $3 for the first hour, maybe $4 for the second, and around $10 for the whole night. My only real responsibility was to hand out keys and carry a little plastic basket to the rooms. Whenever someone walked in, they would just tap on the counter, I would toss them a key attached to a heavy piece of plastic, and then I would put together this cheap plastic basket. Inside the basket, I had to put a sticky TV remote, 2 packets of generic shampoo, a couple of hard toothbrushes, and 2 bottles of water. Once the guest went to their room, I would wander down the hall, leave the basket on the table, walk out, and log the time in my notebook. That was it. During my first few days, I used to actually look up and greet the older gangsters respectfully, but after a while, I just stopped caring. Whoever knocked, I just tossed the key without even looking at their face. I know you guys listening probably think I am dragging this out, but you have to understand how mind-numbing this routine was, so you can grasp why my brain completely short-circuited when things started going wrong. I was so used to seeing absolute garbage human beings walking through those doors that my survival instinct was basically turned off. So it was a few days into my first week, and it was a really weird night because we actually had some normal people staying with us. Apparently, there was a big family wedding in the neighborhood, and the relatives ran out of sleeping space at their house, so they forced some of the overflow guests to rent a room at our sketchy dump. They were clearly disgusted by the place, complaining loudly about the stains and the smell before they finally dragged their bags into room 106. They had driven down from the city in 2 cars, a white sedan and a big black SUV, and they parked both of them right out front in the dirt lot. After they went to sleep, the motel got dead quiet. I was just lounging in my folding chair behind the desk, fighting off sleep while watching some blurry late-night shows. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe past 12:43 a.m. or something, but the absolute silence was suddenly broken by a sharp tapping on the wooden counter. I did not even bother looking up at first because I assumed it was just another junkie needing a place to crash. I reached over, grabbed the key for room 107, and slid it across the desk. When I did that, I caught a glimpse of the hand that grabbed it. It was this incredibly skinny skeletal arm, just pale skin stretched tightly over bone with blue veins bulging out, snatching the key with this jerky, unnatural motion. I heard the heavy plastic keychain jingling in this steady metallic rhythm as the person walked down the dark hallway toward the room. I yawned, rubbed my eyes, and slowly put together the plastic basket with the remote, the water bottles, and the toiletries. I dragged my feet down the hallway, expecting to just push the door open and leave the stuff on the table like always. But when I turned the knob for room 107, it was completely locked from the inside. I was instantly annoyed. I knocked on the door and raised my voice, telling the guy inside to open up so I could give him his TV remote and his water. Nobody answered me. The room behind the door was totally silent for a second, and then suddenly the TV inside turned on. This made absolutely zero sense because the remote was sitting right there in the plastic basket in my hands, and those old wall-mounted CRT TVs were the ancient antenna kinds that you had to physically twist a dial to change, so it couldn't just flip channels on its own. I stood there frozen as I heard the loud static noise of the TV scanning through channels in this aggressive crackling burst of white noise. It jumped from the news to a movie to traditional opera singing before it finally stopped on a music channel, like Yan TV or ATV back in the day. It immediately started blasting some upbeat pop song at maximum volume, making the thin wooden door vibrate against my knuckles. I just shook my head and muttered to myself about how these freaking tweakers always ruined my shift. I figured the guy had brought his own universal remote, or something stupid like that, and he was already completely out of his mind on whatever chemicals he was doing. I carried the basket back to the reception desk, dropped it on the counter, and threw myself back into my folding chair, just trying to ignore the muffled thumping of the bass coming from down the hall. Keep in mind, room 107 was a whole 6 rooms away from the front desk, so hearing it that loudly was just ridiculous. I must have dozed off for a few minutes. Suddenly, there was another sharp tapping on the counter. My eyes snapped open, blurry and dry, and my muscle memory kicked in. I just grabbed a key, tossed it onto the desk, and immediately shut my eyes again. But literally 30 seconds later, tap, tap, tap. I jerked my head up, and the key I had just put down was still sitting right there on the counter. I got a little pissed off and mumbled out loud, asking if the person was blind or something. I literally thought to myself, why don't you just drop dead so I can sleep? I finally looked up, and standing right in front of the desk was a man. He was dressed entirely in denim, wearing a faded denim jacket, dirty jeans, and a denim baseball cap pulled down so low that it completely cast a shadow over his face. I honestly wondered if his underwear was made of denim too. He stood completely still, his head tilted downward. He did not yell or act aggressive. He just mumbled in this raspy, hollow voice that he needed 2 bottles of water for room 107. I let out an annoyed sigh and told him that I had just tried to bring his stuff to the room, but he had locked me out. I told him I would just give him the basket right now so he could carry it himself. I turned around for maybe 2 seconds to grab the plastic basket off the back counter. When I turned back around, he was gone. I looked down both ends of the hallway, and there was absolutely no sign of him. No footsteps, no shadows, nothing. It was like he had evaporated into the humid air. I was really starting to lose my patience at this point. I grabbed the basket, stomped down the hallway, and marched right up to room 107. The music was still booming through the door. I grabbed the handle, and this time, it turned easily. The door wasn't locked anymore. I pushed it open and stepped inside, expecting to see the guy in the denim jacket sprawled out on the mattress, but the room was completely empty. These rooms were tiny, so there was literally nowhere to hide. There was just the bare mattress, the buzzing wall fan, the blaring TV, and the bathroom. I looked over at the bathroom, and the door was wide open, revealing the small tiled space. Nobody was in there. The shower was dry. The toilet was empty. I stood there holding the basket, feeling this creeping sense of dread crawling up the back of my neck. I convinced myself that the guy must have slipped out to find his friends or something while I was walking down the hall. I took 3 steps into the room, placed the basket heavily on the small wooden table, and turned around to leave. As I was walking back toward the doorway, reaching my hand out to grab the edge of the door, something hit me. It was a massive, violent shove directly to the center of my back. It felt like 2 solid, freezing cold hands planting themselves between my shoulder blades and launching me forward. I stumbled hard, my arms flailing as I barely caught my balance before face-planting into the concrete hallway floor. As I was stumbling out, the door to room 107 slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash that rattled the walls. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my shoulders, trying to process the phantom pain radiating from my back. I stared at the closed door, completely bewildered. I tried to defend my own sanity, telling myself that the guy must have been hiding pressed flat behind the door in some weird drug-induced paranoia, and he just shoved me out so he could lock himself back in. It was a stupid excuse, but when you are a 15-year-old kid alone in a sketchy motel in the middle of the night, you force your brain to believe whatever keeps you from completely losing your mind. I walked back to the desk, rubbing my back, cursing under my breath. I sat down and tried to focus on my tiny TV screen, but my hands were shaking. About 15 minutes later, the door to room 106 opened. The older guy from the city who had parked the cars outside walked up to the desk wearing nothing but his boxer shorts. He looked furious. He complained bitterly that it was nearly 1:30 a.m. and the guy next door in 107 was playing music so loud that the bass was shaking their walls, and his 3 or 4 little kids couldn't sleep because the guy was also slamming his fists against the partition. He got right in my face and threatened to smack me upside the head, basically saying that if he didn't respect my boss, he would have beaten the crap out of me right there. I felt my stomach tie into a cold knot. I apologized profusely, told him I would go handle it, and promised to make the guy turn the TV off. Honestly, in any normal situation at this motel, nobody complained about the noise because everyone was doing illegal stuff anyway. But since this was a normal family, I had to do my job. I marched back down the hall to 107. The music was still thumping relentlessly. I raised my fist and banged loudly on the wood. The second my knuckles hit the door, the knob clicked, and the door slowly swung inward on its own, opening just a few inches with this awful, slow creaking sound. I pushed it open a bit further and peered inside. The lights were completely off now. The only light in that dump was the frantic, flashing blue glow from the TV screen. And right there, in the far corner of the room, wedged between the end of the bed and the bare wall, was the man. He was shirtless now, his pale, sickly skin glowing under the blue light. He was still wearing the dirty jeans and the denim cap, but he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, facing the corner, with his back to the door, hunched over like a toad in a hole with his hands resting on his thighs like he was meditating. He was literally just skin and bones. His spine was sticking out in these sharp, jagged bumps, and his ribs looked like they were going to tear through his skin. He was rocking back and forth in this repetitive, manic rhythm, completely ignoring me. I cleared my throat, trying to mask the absolute terror in my voice. I asked him politely to turn the music down because he was keeping the neighbors awake. He didn't respond. He just kept rocking, his bones shifting under his skin. I asked him again, a little louder. Still nothing. I figured he was completely paralyzed on whatever terrible drug he had injected, so I decided to just do it myself. The plastic basket was still sitting on the table, exactly where I had left it. The remote completely untouched. I took a deep breath, stepped into the dark room, and reached out for the remote. Before my fingers even grazed the plastic buttons, the volume on the TV began to lower itself. It didn't just mute instantly. The volume bar appeared on the screen and slowly ticked down, notch by notch, dragging out the decreasing sound until the room was completely silent except for the clicking of the ceiling fan. I froze, my breath hitched in my throat. I looked at the guy in the corner. He had not moved his arms at all. He was still sitting with his hands resting on his thighs, rocking back and forth. I backed away slowly. terrified to take my eyes off him. I made it to the doorway, stepped out into the hall, and the second my foot cleared the threshold, that same invisible freezing force slammed into my chest, shoving me backward into the opposite wall as the door slammed shut in my face again. I scrambled back to the reception desk, my chest heaving. I sat there hugging my knees, officially terrified. I promised myself I would not go near that hallway again until the sun came up. But the nightmare wasn't over. Not even close. About 20 minutes later, out in the dark dirt lot, both of the car alarms went off simultaneously. The blaring horns and flashing headlights cut through the silent night in this chaotic, aggressive pulsing noise that made me jump out of my chair. I ran to the front entrance and looked out the glass doors. The white sedan was just flashing its lights, but the black SUV was physically moving. It was rocking violently from side to side, the heavy suspension squeaking and groaning as if someone massive was jumping up and down inside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and ran out the front door. As I stepped into the humid night air, the car alarms abruptly cut out, leaving this ringing silence in my ears. I shined my light toward the SUV, and I swear to God, I saw the guy in the denim hat. He was sitting cross-legged right on the roof of the black SUV, rocking back and forth in the exact same manic rhythm as before. I yelled out, asking what the hell he thought he was doing on a customer's car. I slipped on my flip-flops to march out there and cuss him out. But when I looked up a second later, the roof of the SUV was completely empty. I walked closer, my legs feeling like lead. I shined my flashlight through the driver's side window of the locked SUV. He was inside. The man was sitting in the driver's seat, his head still tilted down, his pale hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes half closed and looking completely spaced out, like he was peaking on meth. Even though the engine was completely off and the power steering was dead, he was violently cranking the wheel back and forth. I heard the tires grinding against the concrete pavement in this awful squealing, stretching noise that made my teeth hurt, shifting the massive vehicle left and right while he sat locked inside. I completely lost it. I ran back inside, sprinted down the hall to room 106, and hammered on the door. I told the older guy that the crazy tweaker from next door had somehow broken into his locked car and was actively destroying it. The man cursed, grabbed his electronic keys, and ran outside in his bare feet. I chased after him. When we got to the dirt lot, the cars were perfectly still. The man pressed his unlock button, yanked the door of the SUV open, and checked the interior. There was absolutely no one inside. No damage. No sign of a break-in. He turned around and got right in my face, screaming at me, asking if I thought this was some kind of sick joke, and again threatened to beat me down for harassing a paying customer in the middle of the night. I was almost in tears. I tried to explain that I had seen the guy with my own 2 eyes, but the man just shoved past me, marching back inside. I followed him like a scared dog, apologizing the whole way. He reached room 106, gave me one last disgusted look, and stepped inside. As his door clicked shut, the door to room 107 slowly creaked open. Just a few inches. The hallway was dimly lit, but I could clearly see the man in the denim hat standing in the gap. He had both hands gripping the door frame, his knuckles white. His face was still mostly hidden by the shadow of the cap, but the lower half of his face was visible. He was smirking. It was this wide, unnatural, stretching smile that bared his teeth in the darkness, a silent, mocking grin that completely broke my brain. I backed away, my heart hammering so hard I thought it was going to crack my ribs, and I practically sprinted back to the front desk. I sat there in pure agony for another hour. Around 2:30 a.m., a group of about 5 sketchy guys pulled up in a couple of beat-up sedans. They were obvious junkies, tweaking and looking for a place to light up. The lead guy came to the desk and slapped some cash down, asking for a room. I was so exhausted and terrified I just shook my head and told them we were completely booked. The guy scoffed, pointing down the hallway. He argued that room 107 was sitting wide open. The bed was totally unmade, and nobody was inside. He accused me of trying to hold out on them. I was too tired to argue. I just shoved the money in the drawer and told them to take it if they wanted it. They grabbed a bunch of waters and headed down the hall, laughing and carrying their stash, their rigs, pipes, and gear. I sat back, staring at the clock, praying for the sun to rise. Exactly 7 minutes later, the chaotic sound of boots tearing down the hallway echoed through the lobby. All 5 of the guys came sprinting around the corner, tripping over each other in sheer panic. One guy didn't even have his shirt on properly, just wearing it slung over his neck as he ran. They bolted out the front doors, practically jumping over each other to get into their cars. They were screaming at the top of their lungs about how they had just seen Soren, sounding completely out of their minds. They cranked their engines and tore out of the dirt lot, peeling rubber and disappearing into the night, leaving the front door swinging open behind them. I stood behind the desk, completely paralyzed. You have to understand, drug addicts at that level do not abandon their stash unless they are facing a SWAT team or death. I slowly walked down to room 107. The lights were on, the bed was a mess, and right there on the mattress, perfectly untouched, were their pipes, lighters, and a small bag of crystal meth. Whatever they saw had terrified them so badly, they left hundreds of dollars worth of drugs behind. I quickly gathered their stash, stuffed it into a plastic bag, and hid it in a drawer back at the desk, knowing they would eventually come back for it. Sure enough, about 15 minutes later, the lead junkie crept back into the lobby, looking around like a frightened animal. He quietly asked me for his stuff. I handed him the bag and asked him what the hell had happened, and why they were running from someone named Soren. The guy looked at me, his face completely pale and sweating. He asked me how long I had been working there. I told him it had only been a few days. He let out a shaky breath and explained everything. He told me that Soren was a local addict who preferred shooting up rather than smoking. About 3 weeks before I started working there, Soren had rented room 107 by himself. He had shot up a bad batch, overdosed, and died right there on the bathroom floor. The boss was a powerful guy, so he bribed the local cops, paid off the family for the funeral, and completely buried the story so the motel wouldn't get shut down. None of the new staff knew about it. The junkie wiped his face and told me that when they went into the room, they started unpacking their gear on the bed. Suddenly, they heard this wet, ragged sniffing sound coming from the bathroom, like someone gasping for air. They looked over, and sitting right next to the toilet, hunched over in a denim jacket and a baseball cap, was Soren, slumped against the toilet bowl. He said the ghost was sitting there in the dark, acting out his own death, repeating his final moments of overdose over and over again. I basically ran for my life that morning when the sun finally came up, and I completely wrote off the few bucks I was supposed to get paid for the week, because there was no way I was ever stepping foot in that place again. I spent a few days hiding out, thinking the big boss was going to send someone to rough me up for abandoning my post, but he completely ignored it. Turns out it didn't even matter, because Soren's ghost completely ruined the business in a matter of months, haunting every single person who rented a room and scaring away every junkie and night guard in town. The boss eventually just got fed up, cut his losses, brought in bulldozers, and leveled the entire property to expand his cockfighting farm. My folks got married way back in the early 90s. And just to set the timeline straight, all the insane stuff I am about to tell you actually started way before I was even born. Hell, before my mom was even pregnant with me. Instead of doing the traditional thing and moving in with my grandparents, they built this massive, completely wooden cabin. Now, it wasn't out in the absolute middle of nowhere. It was actually just a few hundred yards from the local market and the river. But the forest right behind our back door, that was deep and untouched virgin forest. My dad, Harrison, was basically a woodsman. He made a pretty decent living by trapping everything from wild boars to rare king cobras, even monkeys, squirrels, and wildcats. People in town used to bust his balls and tease him by calling him an illegal logger, but he wasn't chopping down rare timber or anything. He was just a trapper selling to wealthy locals who wanted exotic meat, or guys who wanted to steep a whole cobra in liquor for their old men to drink. I am just putting this out there for you guys to judge right from the start. Tell me in the comments if you think this is just some crazy rural legend, or if you have ever heard of anything like this happening in deep, isolated woods. I will be down there, answering questions because, honestly, I still cannot wrap my head around it. I need someone to tell me if my dad was just losing his mind or if he actually brought something demonic into our home. When my mom found out she was pregnant with me, she was obviously thrilled, but the financial reality hit them hard. Harrison kicked things into overdrive to save up cash for my arrival. He even hired a buddy of his, who I will call Sawyer, to tag along a few days a week to help carry gear and set up traps much deeper in the woods. Sawyer actually just worked at the local market and wasn't a real woodsman. My dad paid him a flat daily rate. He told Sawyer, "I eat the profits, I swallow the losses. No splitting shares." Before that, my dad usually just went a mile or so into the tree line. The forest behind our house was so dense and dark that you could walk for days and never see a paved road or another human being. It was practically ancient. In fact, he'd been living there for 2 solid years and told my mom he still hadn't even scratched the surface of how deep that damn tree line went. And my dad was a hardcore realist. His survival motto was basically, "God makes the beast, God makes the grass, we just gotta eat." He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that forest spirit bullshit. With a baby on the way, my dad started waking up at maybe 4 a.m. every single morning. He would pack up his rusted machetes and his wire traps and a little metal lunchbox my mom packed with sticky rice. He and Sawyer decided that the shallow parts of the woods were tapped out. They needed to push 5 or 6 miles deep into the pitch-black jungle to find the really valuable game. Sawyer was always a bit of a coward, and he constantly complained about getting lost. He told my dad that they were going too far and that the air felt too heavy back there, but Harrison was a stubborn guy who believed in sweat and dirt and making money. He brushed off the complaints and just told Sawyer to keep walking. One afternoon they were trekking through a part of the forest that looked like it had never been touched by human hands. The canopy was so thick that it blocked out the sun completely. They stumbled into a small clearing, and right in the middle of it was this extremely bizarre tree. My dad told Sawyer later that it was not a massive ancient oak or anything. It was only about as wide as a single person could hug, but it stretched up endlessly into the sky without a single leaf on its branches. My dad even pointed out how screwed up it was that a tree this ancient somehow only grew straight up and never got any thicker. The worst part was the bark. It was covered in these huge swollen lumps that looked exactly like giant human warts just bursting out of the wood. While they were standing there staring at this ugly deformed tree, my dad accidentally kicked something solid hidden in the dead leaves. They dug it out and found this incredibly heavy antique censer. It was an incense burner made of solid bronze. It was totally oxidized and covered in decades of black grime and forest rot. It weighed maybe 7 or 8 pounds, and it had these strange old characters carved into the bottom of it. My dad tapped the side of it with his knuckle and heard this dull metallic ringing sound echoing out through the damp trees like a temple bell. There was no shrine nearby. There were no offerings and no pathways, just a heavy bronze censer sitting alone in the middle of a dead clearing. Sawyer was immediately freaked out. He looked around the empty woods and told my dad that this was absolute bullshit, and that things like this do not just exist in the middle of nowhere without a reason. He begged my dad to leave it right where it was. He said whoever left it there was probably worshiping something they should not mess with. My dad verbally agreed with Sawyer just to shut him up. He said, "Yeah, you are right, let us leave it." But my dad was a practical man who only saw a giant chunk of valuable metal that could feed his unborn kid for a year. When Sawyer turned his back, my dad quietly shoved the heavy bronze censer deep into his trapping sack and carried it all the way home. That evening when he got back to the cabin, he pulled the censer out and handed it to my pregnant mom. He told her to take it out to the back washing area and scrub the dirt off it. My mom sat there on a tiny wooden stool for hours, with her aching back just scrubbing away decades of black grime with coarse sand and water until the bronze finally started to shine. The next day, my dad skipped his hunting trip and took the censer into town. He sold it to an antique dealer for enough gold to equal maybe a couple $1,000s today, which was an absolute fortune for rural folks back then. He came home and dumped the gold on the wooden table. He told my mom with a huge smile that this was their insurance policy. He told her they finally had enough to pay for the birth and keep me fed until I was a year old. even if he never caught another animal in the woods. My mom was incredibly relieved, but she also felt this sickening knot in her stomach because she knew where it came from. She was deeply superstitious, but the allure of financial security was too strong, so she just swallowed her fear and hid the gold away. Things started getting completely screwed up the very next afternoon. My dad came stomping out of the tree line before the sun even went down, and he looked really pissed. He walked into the house and started yelling at my mom. He demanded to know why the hell she was wandering around a dangerous forest with a pregnant belly. My mom was totally confused and told him she had been home cooking all day. My dad refused to believe her. He told her that he was deep in the woods setting traps when he clearly heard her voice echoing through the trees. He said she kept calling his name over and over again, telling him to come home and eat lunch. He told her the voice called out, then went completely dead silent for like 2 or 3 hours, and then right around 4 p.m., it started echoing out again. He said the voice sounded exactly like her, so he packed up his gear and rushed back. My mom swore up and down that she never left the cabin. My dad just scoffed and told her to stop lying and to never do it again because she could trip on a root and hurt the baby. In those days, wives mostly just stayed quiet when their husbands scolded them, so my mom just let it go and served him dinner. But the next day, it escalated. My dad came home early again, and this time his face was pale and he looked genuinely rattled. He told my mom that he was near the spot where he found the bronze censer and he saw her. He said he looked across the clearing and saw my mom standing about 100 feet away wearing the exact same floral maternity clothes she always wore. He told her that she was standing completely still and waving her hand at him to come closer while calling his name. But when he dropped his machete and ran over to scold her for being out there, she just vanished behind the deformed tree. My mom started crying and begged him to believe that she was sitting in the living room the entire time. I think looking back on it, my dad probably knew deep down that she was telling the truth, but his masculine pride just would not let him admit that he was being hunted by a forest entity. He just aggressively shut down the conversation and strictly forbade her from ever stepping foot near the tree line. Then the somatic changes started happening. A few days later, my mom was doing the laundry out by the water basin early in the morning. She picked up my dad's pants from the day before, and immediately, this intensely familiar, musky smell hit her right in the nose. When she started washing his underwear, she noticed something repulsive. It was soaked in a massive amount of dried semen. I know this is incredibly gross and uncomfortable to talk about, but it is a critical detail because it proved that something physical was happening to him out there. My mom was shocked at first, but then her denial kicked in. She reasoned with herself that since she was pregnant, they had not been intimate in months. She figured my dad was just a healthy guy with normal urges, and maybe he was taking care of himself in the woods or having wet dreams. And honestly, my mom knew him better than anyone. He wasn't some sick pervert. In the bedroom, he was as vanilla as they come, strictly missionary, no crazy stuff. So this sudden, intense physical reaction was totally out of character. She felt embarrassed to even bring it up, so she just washed the clothes in silence. But it kept happening. Every single day for almost a week, his clothes were soiled. And then the sleep talking began. In the dead of night, my dad would start tossing and turning in the bed. He would make these aggressive kissing motions with his mouth and wrap his arms tightly around his own chest while breathing heavily. The weirdest part was that he kept groaning my mom's name. Because he was calling her name, my mom actually felt a weird sense of pity instead of jealousy. She gently woke him up one night and awkwardly asked him if he was having dirty dreams because of her pregnancy. My dad looked embarrassed and laughed it off. He told her that of course he was dreaming about her because he missed his wife, and she just smiled and told him to just hold out until the kid popped out, and then she'd let him do whatever he wanted. But my dad was lying through his teeth. Now, I have to pause here and jump forward a bit, because the only reason we know he was lying is what happened after the fact. Years later, long after the dust had settled and everything was already over, Sawyer finally sat my mom down and confessed what was actually happening out there during those daytime hunting trips. On the days, Sawyer did not go into the woods. My dad would go alone. When they finally reunited for a hunt, my dad looked exhausted, but weirdly ecstatic. He told Sawyer that ever since they took that sensor, the forest had been incredibly generous to him. He was catching massive wild boars and finding rare medicinal mushrooms without even trying. He was easily trading it all for liters of rice, dried fish, and provisions. One time he even brought back this monstrous centipede that was literally thicker than his own thumb, saying the old guys at the market went crazy for it to brew their liquor. But the creepiest part was what he was doing during his lunch breaks. My dad told Sawyer that he had started taking naps right under that deformed wart-covered tree. He said that every time he closed his eyes, he would slip into this incredibly vivid, lucid dream. He told Sawyer that he was not dreaming about his pregnant wife at all. He said he was being visited by some fresh young thing, barely 15 or 16 years old, who would seduce him right there in the dirt. My dad was addicted to it. He described the physical sensations with this sickeningly euphoric look in his eyes, telling Sawyer that it was better than anything he had ever felt in reality. Sawyer was completely disgusted. He tried to laugh it off and told my dad that if he was that desperate, he should just take some of his new gold and go to one of those shady hostess bars in the city, buy a couple of drinks and let off some steam, instead of risking catching some fatal bug out here. My dad just gave him a deadpan look and told him that no high-class city escort could ever compare to the girl in the woods. Sawyer told my mom that my dad talked about this phantom girl for 2 solid weeks. His skin started getting paler, and he looked like a walking skeleton, but he just could not stop going back to that clearing to sleep. Whatever that forest succubus was, it was literally draining the life force out of him through this pure, insane ecstasy, and he was willingly offering himself up on a silver platter. But anyway, bringing it back to the main timeline and what my mom was dealing with at the cabin. The absolute climax of all this madness happened on a freezing Tuesday morning. It was maybe 4:30 a.m. and pitch black outside. Usually my dad did not leave for the woods until the sun came up now that they had the gold. But that morning my mom woke up to find my dad aggressively hugging her in the bed. He was holding onto her so tightly that it actually hurt her ribs. He was kissing her face and crying uncontrollably. Tears were just pouring down his cheeks in the dark. He kept whispering over and over again that he was so sorry and that he loved her so much. He told her that they would definitely be husband and wife again in their next life. My mom was groggy and confused. She asked him what the hell he was talking about and told him to go back to sleep. My dad pulled away and looked her dead in the eyes in the dark. He told her that he had to go into the woods right now because they were calling him to stay there permanently. My mom, in her sleepy, naive state, just assumed he meant Sawyer and the other trappers were waiting for him at the edge of the trees. She just mumbled that he should go so he would not keep them waiting. If she had just been a little more awake or a little more suspicious, she could have locked the door and stopped him. But she just rolled over and went back to sleep. A few hours later, at 8 a.m., Sawyer knocked on the door. He asked my mom where Harrison was because he was supposed to guide the hunt that day. My mom felt a bucket of ice water dump over her head. She realized my dad went into the deep woods completely alone before dawn. She waited all day. The sun went down and the crickets started screaming in the bushes. She sat by the window staring into the wall of trees behind our cabin. My dad had never ever stayed the night in the woods since she got pregnant. Midnight passed, then 2 a.m. The silence in that cabin was absolutely suffocating. Every now and then, she'd hear this faint rustling out in the dead leaves, and her heart would skip a beat, hoping it was him, but then she'd write it off as just stray dogs or cats prowling around. At exactly 4:15 a.m., she heard it. A voice drifted out from the pitch-black tree line. It was my dad's voice, but it sounded hollow and impossibly far away. He was calling out her name. My mom jumped up and ran to the back door. She opened it and stepped right out into her little outdoor dishwashing area to squint into the terrifying darkness of the forest edge. The air was freezing and smelled like wet rot. About 30 yards away, just barely visible in whatever little light the stars were giving off, she saw 2 silhouettes standing together. It was a man and a woman. My mom felt this violent surge of anger and jealousy. She thought my dad had actually brought some local girl back to their property. She was about to yell at him when the male silhouette spoke. His voice did not sound like it was coming from his mouth. It sounded like it was echoing inside her own head. I have to go with her or she will take our child. I messed up, babe. I crossed the line and I'm in too deep. You have to raise him well." Before my mom could even process the horror of those words, the female silhouette reached out and grabbed my dad's hand. She did not just lead him away. She forcefully dragged him backward into the pitch-black tree line. My mom wanted to scream and run after them, but her legs literally gave out. Holy fucking shit. She was paralyzed with primal terror just watching her husband get swallowed by the abyss while clutching her pregnant belly. She collapsed on the floor and stayed there until the sun came up. First thing in the morning, she threw a handful of cash at Sawyer and begged him to take a search party into the deep woods to find her husband. Sawyer was terrified, but he gathered some local guys and they marched into the tree line with machetes. My mom sat on the porch just staring at the trees. Around 1 p.m., she heard Sawyer crying loudly from the forest trail. They emerged from the bushes, carrying a makeshift stretcher woven out of bamboo and thick jungle vines. My dad was lying on it. He was dead. His body was completely naked. His clothes were nowhere to be found. His skin had turned this sickening pale blue color, and he was entirely stiff. But the detail that will forever haunt my family is what was on his skin. His chest, his neck, and his thighs were absolutely covered in violent bloody scratches and these massive dark purple hickeys. It looked like he had been devoured alive by something that wanted to show ownership over his corpse. Sawyer told my mom between sobs that they found him lying right at the base of that wart-covered leafless tree, and the bronze censer that my dad had stolen and sold weeks ago was completely gone. The spot where it used to sit was just an empty depression in the dirt. My mom and Sawyer pieced it together right then and there. It was a fatal ghost marriage. A forest succubus claimed him, and my mom knew there was no point in hiring a shaman or a priest, because no holy man on earth can drag a soul back from the underworld once the deal is sealed. It was just game over. My mom did not even wait for a proper funeral at the cabin. She was so consumed by the paranoid dread that the forest succubus would come back to collect the child my dad bargained for that she paid local workers to completely tear down our wooden cabin that very same afternoon. She fled back to her parents' house in the city and never looked back. All that absolute terror and running for her life completely wrecked her body, and she ended up going into labor way too early. I was born premature, severely underweight, and basically fighting for every single breath in an incubator over at Tudu Hospital. Looking back on my life now, the absolute darkest irony of it all is how I survived. The hospital bills for a premature baby back then were astronomically high. My mom could not afford it. The only way she kept me alive was by slowly snipping off pieces of the gold my dad got from selling that cursed bronze censer. I literally survived on the currency of my father's soul. We never found out what that entity really was, or what kind of ancient spiritual debt my dad accidentally inherited by picking up that piece of metal. But sometimes when I am lying in bed at night, I think about that silhouette dragging him into the dark, and I wonder if that thing is still waiting out there in the trees, just biding its time until it decides it wants his son too. Back in 2017, my folks were working these really grueling contract farming jobs, spraying pesticides all over the place, and out of nowhere, they actually won a brand new scooter in some random agricultural sweepstakes. They ended up gifting it to me since I had just turned 18 and got my license, which was literally the best thing ever at the time. So, a few weeks later, I decided to take it for a spin to visit my childhood friend Lexi, who lived a couple of towns over in Dong Thap. Everything was perfectly fine until her older brother begged to borrow the bike to show off to his buddies and didn't bring it back until way past sunset, completely screwing up my schedule and forcing me to ride back in the pitch black. Let me give you a little more context here, because I really need you to understand my headspace that day and why this whole situation felt so incredibly stressful, even before things got weird. My parents didn't have an easy life by any means. They spent their days out in the blistering heat, inhaling harsh chemicals, and coming home exhausted just to keep food on the table. Over the years, they had won small raffle prizes here and there, like shirts, bags of fertilizer, or tiny gold rings. But 2017 was the year they hit the jackpot. I still remember my dad sitting in the living room, furiously scratching the promo card, and suddenly screaming his lungs out that we won a motorcycle. So winning this bike, which was a basic little Honda Wave Alpha, was basically a miracle for us. It was worth maybe 15 or 20 million dong, which translates to roughly 600 or 800 bucks. And for a family like ours, that was an absolute fortune. When my dad handed me the keys, he told me it was a late birthday present, since on my actual 18th birthday a few months prior, he had just awkwardly handed me some cash to go eat with my friends. I felt this massive sense of responsibility. I was so incredibly proud of it, taking it out for slow rides around the neighborhood, polishing the plastic fairings until they shined. So when I finally took my first real solo trip out to see Lexi, I was over the moon. We hung out, we caught up, and I fully planned to be on the road back to Vinh Long by the late afternoon. But then her older brother, who was this classic show-off type, insisted on taking it for a quick spin around the block to flex on his friends. I couldn't really say no, mainly because when Lexi and I were in middle school, he was the guy who protected us from the local bullies. I owed him that respect, so I handed over the keys at around 4:20 p.m. I sat there in Lexi's living room, checking my phone every 5 minutes. An hour went by, then another. I was getting so frustrated, making awkward small talk with her family, while internally fuming, and by the time he finally rolled back into the yard with my bike, it was creeping past 6 p.m. I didn't even stick around to complain. I just grabbed my stuff, said a hasty goodbye, and got ready to leave. Before I had left home that morning, my uncle had given me a very strict warning about the route. He told me flat out that my driving skills were way too weak to handle the main national highway, especially at night. He warned me that the crosswinds up on the massive Mai Thuan Bridge could literally blow a lightweight bike like mine right over, and he made sure I knew about the massive container trucks that hauled seafood in the dark, blasting their horns and swerving all over the lanes. He strongly suggested I take the smaller, dirt roads that hugged the riverbank instead, claiming they were much safer for a beginner. I fired up the map app on my phone, but the cell service out there in the rural parts of Dong Thap wasn't exactly reliable back then. I noticed right away that the distance was glitching out. It told me I had 50 kilometers left, but after driving for a few minutes, I checked it again and it suddenly jumped to 55. I got so frustrated with the crappy signal that I just pulled over at a random little roadside coffee stall situated near a fork in the road to ask for directions, figuring the locals knew best. I asked the older guy running the stall which way I should go to get back to Vinh Long safely. He pointed to the wide path on the left, explaining it was the main highway but warning me it was super dangerous right now, with all the heavy trucks speeding through, even explicitly mentioning that a fatal accident had just happened there a few days ago. Then he pointed to the narrower path on the right, telling me it was a small river road that was totally deserted and pretty dark, but it would save me over 10 kilometers of travel. Remembering exactly what my uncle had said earlier, I thanked him and steered my bike down the right path. The moment I got onto that river road, the atmosphere shifted. It was so incredibly dark. The stock headlights on a Wave Alpha are famously terrible, casting this pathetic, dim yellow glow that barely illuminated 10 feet of the dirt road in front of me. I had to keep my speed down to maybe 20 or 30 kilometers an hour just to avoid the potholes. The scenery was exactly what you would expect in the rural south, but without the sunlight, it felt completely alien. On my right was the vast, dark expanse of the river, and on my left were sporadic, silent houses, random patches of overgrown rice fields, empty rice milling factories, and the occasional cluster of cement graves built right onto the dirt shoulders. The silence was suffocating, only broken by the slow, heavy, relentless chug-chug-chug of a barge navigating the river waters somewhere out in the pitch-black distance, making the whole ride feel incredibly isolated and eerie. After what felt like half an hour of creeping along, I started feeling really uneasy. A couple of times I saw people sitting outside their houses, and I slowed down to ask if I was heading the right way toward Vinh Long. and they just kept vaguely gesturing forward, telling me to keep going, and that it was just a little bit further. I eventually pulled over to check my map again, hoping the signal had caught up. The screen glowed in the dark, telling me I had exactly 5 kilometers left before I needed to make a left turn onto a larger road. That gave me a little bit of hope. As I was putting my phone away, I glanced across the dirt path. Sitting there in the dim ambient light was an old woman, probably in her late 50s, wearing a matching floral pajama set that a lot of older women wear around the countryside. She was sitting on a cheap plastic chair, slumped over, resting her head in her hand, and looking absolutely devastated, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Right behind her was a freshly built cement grave, painted bright white, which made it practically glow against the dark rural backdrop. But she wasn't alone. Sitting cross-legged right on top of the flat part of the grave was a young guy. He had this total local punk aesthetic going on, wearing a tacky yellow checkered long-sleeve shirt, standard blue jeans, and these cheap fake Gucci sandals. He was aggressively bouncing his leg up and down, leaning back on his hands, looking straight at me with this arrogant expression. Before I could look away, he smirked, raised his eyebrows, and actually started making gross kissy noises at me, like the way you'd catcall or call a dog. "Why don't you come be my mom's daughter-in-law, huh?" He mocked. "Why don't you come inside and sleep over at my house tonight? I promise I won't do anything to you. Tomorrow I'll send my mom over with the dowry, so we can take you home." I felt this immediate spike of annoyance mixed with a cold chill. I just assumed he was some local creep harassing women in the dark. But the strangest part, the part that really messed with my head, was the mother. She just sat there looking miserable, staring off into space, not saying a single word to reprimand him for being so incredibly disrespectful. Normally, a mother down here would smack her kid for talking to a stranger like that, especially sitting on a grave, but she acted like he wasn't even there. I didn't want to stick around to figure out their weird family dynamic, so I just hit the gas and kept riding, eager to get those last 5 kilometers over with. I drove for another 15 or maybe 20 minutes, keeping my eyes glued to the dirt path illuminated by my weak headlight, but the road just kept stretching on, with no left turn in sight. My intuition was screaming at me that something was wrong. I pulled over to the side of the road again to check the map. It still said 5 kilometers. No change. I let out a sigh of frustration, and when I looked up, my stomach completely dropped. I was back at the exact same spot. There was the same old woman, sitting in the same plastic chair, wearing the same floral pajamas. There was the same white cement grave, and there was the same guy in the yellow checkered shirt, sitting cross-legged, bouncing his leg. He looked right at me, his grin widening in the dark. "You like me, don't you? You're not getting away from me. You're staying right here." A wave of pure nausea hit me. This was absolute bullshit. I genuinely thought my brain was playing tricks on me because of the fatigue and the dark, or that maybe the rural roads just looked identical. So I gripped the handlebars, hit the throttle hard, and sped off again, my heart hammering against my ribs. I need to pause here for a second, because if anyone listening to this has ever experienced a spatial loop, where the landscape literally just resets itself no matter how far or how fast you drive, please tell me in the comments, because I need to know I'm not the only one who has gone through this. I know it sounds completely irrational to anyone sitting safely in their bed right now. You're probably wondering why I didn't just turn around and go back to the highway. But when you are physically trapped in it, you don't instantly jump to the conclusion that ghosts are messing with you. You just desperately try to rationalize it, convincing yourself that you missed a turn, or that the map is broken, or that your eyes are just tired. I drove for another 20 minutes, pushing the bike faster, the engine whining against the quiet night, the wind whipping past my helmet. I refused to stop. I refused to look at the map. But then, the beam of my headlights swept across the road, and there it was again, the white grave. My map still said 5 kilometers. This time, the guy didn't just sit there. As I slowed down, paralyzed by confusion and fear, he actually stood up on top of the grave. He swung his leg down off the cement ledge like he was about to start walking directly toward my bike. That was the breaking point. The thin veil of logic just shattered. and I was thrown into full, primal panic mode. I was practically hyperventilating, tears stinging the corners of my eyes, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the bike steady. I glanced down at my phone screen, seeing the time was 7:53 p.m. I had been driving on a road that should have taken 30 minutes for almost 2 solid hours. I didn't look back. I just twisted the throttle and bolted into the dark, praying to whatever was listening to just let me go home. I rode as fast as I safely could, my chest tight, every shadow looking like a hand reaching out to grab my tires. After another 10 minutes of blind panic, the scenery started looking familiar again, and I wanted to scream. I slowed down, fully expecting him to be standing in the middle of the road. I pulled over cautiously, but this time, the guy wasn't there. The grave was empty. It was just the old woman. She stood up slowly, her back hunched over, and she waved her paper fan at me, signaling me to come closer. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to drive away, but I felt this strange magnetic pull, so I kept my engine running and slowly rolled my bike over to her side of the road. Before I could even open my mouth, she immediately started scolding me, her voice tired and raspy, asking me what on earth I was doing driving back and forth past her house for the last hour. She literally listed out my exact movements, complaining that she had watched me drive up, pull over right in front of her house, pull out my phone to stare at it, and then speed off, only to loop back and do it all over again. I was so confused, and I desperately tried to defend myself, telling her with a trembling voice that I had only been driving straight the entire time, that I hadn't turned around once. She looked at me like I was completely out of my mind and told me she had been sitting out here all evening to keep her son company, explaining that today marked exactly the 5th week since he passed away. My blood ran absolutely cold. I looked past her wrinkled face to the white cement grave. Earlier, I hadn't paid attention to the details, but now I looked closely. I couldn't see the memorial portrait photo because it was completely covered by a massive pile of fruit and incense offerings, but sitting right there on top of the offering platter, laid out perfectly and meticulously, were actual clothes. A yellow checkered long-sleeve shirt, blue jeans, and a pair of fake Gucci sandals. Holy fucking shit. It was him. The guy who had been flirting with me. The guy whose face I had seen so clearly. The guy who tried to step off the grave toward me. Was the dead son. I started trembling uncontrollably, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. I practically begged the woman to tell me I was seeing things, frantically explaining that I had seen a guy in those exact clothes sitting on the grave making kissy faces at me, telling me he wanted me to be his bride. The old woman didn't scream. She didn't look shocked. Instead, she gave this incredibly sad, hollow little laugh that made my skin crawl. She told me, in this fond but tired tone, that she had 4 daughters, and he was her youngest and only son. She admitted he was an absolute degenerate playboy when he was alive, sleeping around wildly with multiple women, constantly bringing home all sorts of sketchy girls with neon-dyed hair and full-body tattoos. He ultimately got himself stabbed to death over a stupid dispute at a local illegal cockfight. She looked at me with this weird mix of pity and pride, saying that I must be a really good, decent girl for him to take a liking to me, and that she honestly felt lucky he was still showing his playful personality, even from the other side. My mind was reeling. She was normalizing this absolute nightmare. She then explicitly warned me to stay on my bike and not to step anywhere near his grave, terrified that his spirit might actually try to possess me if I got too close. She went over to light some fresh incense to scold him, promising to tell him to stop messing with me so I could finally find my way out of the loop and go home. While she turned her back to arrange the incense sticks, I kept my head down, staring at the dirt, absolutely terrified to look at the grave again. But my eyes naturally, against my own will, drifted up past the grave toward the dark window of their small, unlit house, and standing right there, framed perfectly in the pitch black of the open window, I saw him. He was so unnervingly skinny, his face gaunt with high cheekbones, his hair parted down the middle, looking completely solid, but undeniably wrong. He was looking right down at me, from inside the dark house, and he was smiling. I could see this little snaggletooth, catching the faint ambient moonlight, and as I sat there frozen, unable to breathe, unable to look away, he slowly, deliberately raised his hand and waved bye-bye at me, his fingers curling in this mocking, playful rhythm. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just sat there gripping the handlebars until my knuckles turned white, staring at him waving in the dark until I heard the old woman clap her hands together, breaking the spell. She told me she had just scolded him and casually added that if he tried to mess with me again, she was going to grab a straw broom and beat his gravestone with it. She said I was free to go now. I didn't even say thank you. I didn't say goodbye. I just slammed the bike into gear and bolted as fast as the engine could carry me. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, it was almost 9 p.m., and I just completely broke down sobbing the second I saw my mom. My dad was absolutely furious when I told them what happened. He was literally ready to drive back out there and find a black magic practitioner to put a death curse on the guy's grave. But my mom stopped him, saying we should just pity the poor old woman who was grieving her dead son. Honestly, the whole thing traumatized me so badly that I refused to ride a bike again until I was 20, and even now, I will never take a long trip by myself. When I was a teenager, I was thrown headfirst into the chaotic evening shifts of a local movie screening cafe. Honestly, I was completely out of my depth. It was the kind of place that drew huge crowds of loud chain-smoking guys who would sit around arguing about old martial arts movies until closing time. I was just this naive kid, desperately trying to look professional, while dodging between crammed plastic tables and ignoring the weird looks from older men. My brain was so hyper-focused on surviving the shift and proving to my mom that I was not totally useless. It is crazy how a mundane fear like getting yelled at by your boss can completely blind you to the fact that something deeply wrong is lurking right across the street. To give you some context about how things worked back in the early 90s, you have to understand that not everyone had a TV in their living room. Televisions were these massive, expensive boxes that needed complicated antennas, and most working-class folks just could not afford them. So local businesses adapted. People would open up these massive open-air sidewalk cafes near busy markets or highways. They would set up hundreds of cheap plastic chairs, facing 2 or 3 giant screens playing pirated Hong Kong action movies or late-night soccer matches. And honestly, some of the sketchier, dimly lit places even played pole dancing videos or straight-up adult movies just to drag in a bigger crowd of shady guys. The place I worked at was owned by this very strict woman named Beatrice, and she ran a really tight ship. I was barely 16 and a middle school dropout. I had been helping my mom sell fruit at the market, but we were really struggling and needed more money to keep food on the table. My mom practically dragged me to Beatrice to beg for a night shift job. At first, Beatrice totally shot us down. She told my mom she already hired her niece from the countryside and did not need anyone else. I remember feeling this crushing sense of failure as we walked home, even though it was not my fault. But about 3 weeks later, Beatrice called my mom back, complaining that her niece had a really screwed up attitude and had quit out of nowhere. I remember my mom yelling at me to hurry up, and I practically threw myself into the shower, scrubbing off the market dirt in a total frenzy, throwing on my only decent shirt before we rushed over there on her bike. I was hired on the spot for the evening shift from 5 to 9. Working there was an absolute sensory overload. The cafe was always packed with people and the ambient noise was deafening. You had the blaring action movies overlapping with the screaming soccer commentators and the endless roar of motorbike traffic on the dirt road. Beatrice had this one golden rule for the waitresses. We were absolutely forbidden from looking at the TV screens. She told me I had to stand near the counter and keep my eyes glued to the customers in the dark. If someone even twitched their hand or looked like their glass was empty, I had to run over and push another drink on them. That was how she made her money. The drinks were cheap, but people would sit there for 4 hours and order 3 or 4 glasses. I did not do any of the brewing because I was too new, and honestly the whole process looked incredibly stressful. Making coffee back then was a painfully slow process using these old cloth filters and dripping metal contraptions that took forever to get a single dark drop. It wasn't just basic black coffee either, because we had to whip up these ridiculously complicated egg coffees that took forever to beat by hand, or brew iced Lipton tea, or squeeze fresh lemon sugar water while sweating bullets over the massive melting ice buckets. My only job was to balance heavy plastic trays full of drinks and navigate the sea of plastic chairs without spilling anything. I was getting paid maybe 20 or 30,000 dong a shift, which was basically a little over $1 back then. But the real money was in the tips. Since I was a fairly cute young girl, the drunk guys would hand me these tiny 500 or 5,000 dong bills and just wave me off, telling me to keep the change, so I put up with the exhaustion. The cafe was huge, literally spilling out onto the sidewalk, because the city cops were not strict about encroaching on public property back then. But the seating was weirdly divided based on what was playing. The areas in front of the soccer games and Hong Kong action movies were packed shoulder to shoulder with screaming guys. But way off to the side, near the absolute darkest edge of the property, there was a single smaller TV, playing these old, slow-paced traditional operas. Nobody ever sat in that opera corner, unless the rest of the place was literally overflowing, so it was usually just dead quiet and incredibly isolated over there. My first shift was on a Saturday, and I was sweating bullets the entire time. I was so scared of messing up that I just kept my head down and hustled. Nothing weird happened that first night. I was just a tired kid with sore feet. The real nightmare started on my second day. It was a Sunday, actually. No, I think the first time I saw him was around 7:15 p.m., or maybe 7:30 p.m. The crowd was thinning out early because people had factory shifts the next morning. The rush had died down, and I was wiping down a sticky table when the landline rang. Beatrice answered it and then aggressively waved me over. She handed me this heavy plastic tray, loaded up with 7 iced coffees and 5 glass bottles of soda. She told me I had to deliver it to the slaughterhouse down the alley right across the street. The other older waitresses, who were all actual adults around 20 or 21 years old, were completely slammed serving the noisy soccer crowd, so Beatrice had no choice but to send the new kid. I had never been in that alley before. Beatrice pointed to this incredibly narrow pitch-black gap between 2 concrete buildings across the main road. She said the slaughterhouse was about 100 meters deep inside. I grabbed the tray and walked over. The moment I stepped out of the streetlights and into that alley, the atmosphere completely shifted. The temperature dropped, and the smell hit me like a physical punch to the gut. It was this suffocating mixture of raw pork blood, rusting metal, and weeks-old garbage fermenting in the humid air. I was walking very carefully, trying not to trip over the uneven dirt path. I made it to the slaughterhouse and handed the drinks to the workers in the back. One of the younger butchers started hitting on me right away, asking if the cafe had a new pretty girl, and offering to walk me home. I politely shot him down, telling him my boss would chew me out if I lingered. He laughed and asked if I knew about the thing at the front of the alley. Before he could explain, an older butcher smacked him on the shoulder and told him to stop scaring the new girl, muttering that the incident happened months ago and there was nothing to worry about. I thought they were just messing with a naive teenager, so I grabbed the cash and hurried back out. I was almost at the end of the alley, just a few feet away from the safety of the streetlights, when I saw him. There was a man lying flat on his back in the dirt, right at the corner where the alley met the road. I was instantly confused because I swore on my life that the path was completely empty when I walked in 5 minutes ago. He looked completely homeless. He had no blanket, no cardboard, nothing. He was just lying bare in this massive puddle of stagnant drain water. It was the designated spot where all the drunk guys would go to pee, so the ground was slick with this foul-smelling slime and buzzing with fat flies. I tried to walk past him as fast as I could without making eye contact, but as I passed, he lazily rolled his head toward me. He asked me to bring him a milk coffee. I just kept walking. I judged him immediately, assuming a guy sleeping in a puddle of urine definitely did not have the cash to pay for a cafe drink. I took about 3 steps toward the main road when he spoke again. He told me to go tell Beatrice to make that old guy Barney a milk coffee and promised he would pay for it. That stopped me dead in my tracks. It felt incredibly strange that this random guy in the dirt knew my boss by her actual name. He spoke with such casual authority that my naive teenage brain just assumed he was some old regular named Barney who had fallen on hard times. I nervously agreed and practically sprinted back across the street to the cafe. I ran straight to the counter and told Beatrice that some old guy named Barney in the alley wanted a milk coffee. The reaction I got was totally unhinged. Beatrice went pale and immediately started aggressively waving her hands in my face. She loudly hushed me and told me to completely forget about it. She stammered out this frantic excuse, saying she already gave him a coffee that morning and that we were absolutely not serving him anything else. She literally shoved me back out onto the floor and ordered me to keep working. I felt this deep twisting knot of guilt in my stomach. I had promised this pathetic old man a drink, and now my boss was refusing to make it. I stood near the edge of our seating area looking across the street into the dark mouth of the alley. I could still see him lying there in the shadows, about 100 feet away. I watched him physically roll over in the dirt. I was so anxious he was going to get up and come yell at me for lying to him. I kept checking over my shoulder while serving tables. Maybe 10 minutes passed, and when I looked back, the spot by the drain was completely empty. I just assumed he sobered up and walked away. Things got a little busier as the night dragged on. At around 8:30 p.m., I was carrying a single black coffee to the very edge of our seating area. We had chairs spilling far out onto the pavement, right up to the edge of the darkness, where the light from the TVs could not reach. I kept my eyes completely glued to the tray, because the cups were always filled to the absolute brim, and if I spilled even a drop, Beatrice would dock my pay. I reached the empty table in the back corner, where that depressing opera was playing on mute. I set the glass down and looked up. The customer I was looking for wasn't there. Instead, that old guy Barney was sitting in the colorful string chair. My heart completely flatlined in my chest. Sitting right in front of me on a cheap classic plastic string chair, the kind woven with these garish neon red, blue, purple, and yellow plastic cords, was the exact same man from the puddle. He was sitting in this incredibly arrogant posture. He was leaning way back in the chair with one bare, filthy foot propped up on the table right next to the coffee I just put down, and his other foot planted on the ground. He glared at me with these deeply sunken eyes. "Where is my milk coffee? You are taking too long." He yelled it. It was not a whisper. He projected his voice so loudly it should have turned the heads of every single person sitting in that section. But I looked around, and the two guys sitting at the next table were just blankly staring at the soccer match, smoking their cigarettes. Nobody reacted. Nobody even glanced in our direction. I was trembling so badly I could barely form a sentence. I mumbled a panicked apology. I just noped the heck out and scrambled backward, almost tripping over my own feet, trying to get away from him. I practically tackled the counter, trying to get Beatrice's attention. I desperately tried to tell her that the homeless guy from the alley was sitting at our back table getting angry. Beatrice slammed a rag down on the counter and looked at me like I had lost my mind. She aggressively whispered that I needed to stop bringing up his name because nobody was sitting back there. Her intense denial made my stomach tie into knots, because I knew for an absolute fact I was not seeing things. I slowly turned my head to point him out to her. The colorful woven chair was empty. There was nobody there. I spent the last half hour of my shift in a state of quiet panic. I kept telling myself it was just the stress of the job, playing tricks on my eyes. When 9 o'clock finally rolled around, Beatrice turned off the big TVs and locked up the front gate. The other waitresses, who were all actual adults, hopped on their bicycles and pedaled away into the dark around 9:15 p.m. Beatrice had already locked herself inside for the night, leaving me completely alone, standing on the edge of the curb, waiting for my dad to pick me up on his old motorbike. He was running late, doing some random errands, which he tended to do a lot, and I was so frustrated that he left me stranded there in the dark. The street was dead quiet. Nha Trang back then was not a late-night city. By 9, it felt like a ghost town. I was just standing there kicking a pebble when I heard a raspy voice right next to my left ear. "You little brat, I ordered that coffee ages ago. You think you are too good to serve me?" The voice was so close, I could literally feel the damp air displacement against my skin. It was right there. I instinctively spun around to apologize, thinking he had sneaked up behind me in the dark. There was no one behind me. I froze. The silence was absolutely suffocating until I heard the exact same raspy voice right next to my ear again, demanding to know why I was refusing a paying customer. My breathing hitched, and I slowly looked across the wide, empty street. 30 yards away, sitting directly under the flickering streetlight at the mouth of the alley, was him. He was sitting cross-legged in the dirt. He raised a rotting, trembling arm and pointed a single bony finger directly at my face. He was 100 feet away, but his angry voice was vibrating inside my ear canal like he was pressing his mouth against my head. My brain just straight up short-circuited trying to figure out how the hell his voice was inside my ear when his dead-looking body was sitting 100 feet away in the dirt. I realized right then that I was looking at something that belonged to the dead. My knees gave out and I collapsed onto the concrete sidewalk. I buried my face in my hands and started sobbing, hysterically, unable to process the absolute violation of my physical space. I had nowhere to run, and my boss was fast asleep inside her locked house behind me. I sat there crying on the curb for a few minutes until my dad finally pulled up. He saw me shaking on the ground and panicked, asking who had hurt me. I practically vaulted onto the back of his motorbike and begged him to just drive. As we sped away from the cafe, I completely broke down and told him everything about the puddle, the missing coffee, and the voice in my ear. My dad let out a heavy sigh and told me this guy was just a miserable old butcher who lived on the most screwed-up diet you could imagine. He worked grueling night shifts cutting up meat, and his only fuel was endless glasses of sickeningly sweet, condensed milk coffee during the day and cheap hard liquor all night. He never drank a single drop of clean water, so he ended up getting severe liver cirrhosis and diabetes. A few months prior, his organs finally gave out. After a brutal early morning shift, he had stumbled out of the alley and collapsed right by that filthy drain. He had a massive stroke and died in the mud. I should have quit right then and there, but I grew up poor, and the promise of tip money was an incredibly strong anchor, keeping me tied to that horrible place. I convinced myself that if I just avoided the alley, I would be fine. The next day was Monday. The cafe was a bit slower, so Beatrice decided to hire a new boy named Dylan to handle the heavy lifting and the delivery runs. He was only 17, just a year older than me. Around 7:30 that evening, the landline rang again. It was the exact same order for the slaughterhouse. 7 coffees and 5 sodas. Beatrice packed the tray and shoved it into Dylan's hands, telling him to run it across the street. I felt a cold spike of dread in my chest, but I was too shy and intimidated by the social dynamics of the time to speak up to a teenage boy I had just met. I watched him cross the street and disappear into the darkness of the alley. When Dylan finally came back out, he looked visibly shaken. He kept glancing nervously over his shoulder into the pitch-black gap between the buildings. I walked over and quietly asked him what was wrong. He rubbed the back of his neck and complained about this crazy old man lying near a smelly drain in the alley who kept ordering a milk coffee. Dylan was worried he would have to pay for it out of pocket if the guy did not have cash. I opened my mouth to frantically warn him that he had just talked to a corpse, but Beatrice materialized out of nowhere and loudly scolded us for standing around talking while customers were waiting. We instantly scattered back to work. I kept an eye out for Dylan, wanting to pull him aside, but he completely vanished. He had been missing for that entire 45-minute window, and honestly, Beatrice and I both assumed the kid just got lazy and ditched the job on his first night. At exactly 8:45 p.m., I grabbed a tray with a single black coffee for a customer sitting in the very back corner. It was the same isolated table, near the edge of the darkness, playing the traditional opera. I was staring down at my tray, navigating the chairs. I set the cup down and looked up. The customer I was looking for wasn't there. Instead, Dylan was sitting in the colorful string chair. He was leaning way back in the cheap plastic chair, with one foot violently kicked up onto the table and the other planted on the ground. The exact same arrogant posture. His head rolled lazily on his neck, and he slowly raised his hand, beckoning me over with a stiff, unnatural wave. I honestly had no concept of spiritual possession at the time. I just thought this teenage boy was slacking off and trying to play a stupid prank. I got incredibly annoyed and snapped at him, asking what the hell he was doing quitting in the middle of a shift. I told him if he wanted a coffee so badly, he could go inside and order it from Beatrice himself instead of acting like a jerk. Dylan's face contorted into an expression of pure, unfiltered hatred. He violently kicked the table away, sending the hot black coffee flying. He lunged forward with terrifying speed and wrapped both of his hands around my throat. His grip was like a steel vise, instantly cutting off my airway. "Where is my fucking milk coffee?" The voice that ripped out of Dylan's throat did not belong to a 17-year-old boy. It was the deep, raspy, gravelly voice of the dead man from the alley. He was shaking me, violently screaming about how he ordered it yesterday and how I was a stuck-up brat. It hit me then that the entity remembered me from Sunday night, and it was looking right at me through Dylan's eyes. Holy shit, the absolute worst part was the smell. Being that close to his face, I was hit with this nauseating wave of rotting garbage and sour alcohol pouring out of Dylan's mouth. I was thrashing and clawing at his fucking hands, trying to breathe, when I heard this horrible wet gurgling sound coming from the back of his throat. He hawked up a massive foul-smelling loogie and spit it directly into my face. The warm, sticky phlegm hit my cheek as he continued to scream in my face, demanding his drink. I was suffocating and crying out for help. Finally, the older men at the nearby tables realized this was not a normal fight and rushed over. They had to physically pry Dylan's fingers off my neck, dragging him down to the concrete. The moment they pinned him, Dylan suddenly went limp. A few seconds later, he snapped awake and started crying hysterically. He grabbed his arm, wincing in pain, because he had physically dislocated his own wrist during the attack. He had absolutely no idea where he was. He swore the last thing he remembered was turning his back on the old man by the drain at 7:30. He had completely lost over an hour of his life, hijacked by a dead man, looking for his fix. The whole cafe went dead silent. Everyone sitting there knew exactly what had just happened. They all knew the lore of the dead slaughterhouse worker. Beatrice was absolutely terrified. She practically shoved my wages into my hands and told me to never come back, muttering that my spirit was too weak and I was just a magnet for bad luck. She gave me a crisp green paper bill worth 100,000 dong. It was roughly $10 back then, but to me it was a massive fortune. It was my very first real paycheck, and it was entirely tainted by that experience. I never went back to that part of town, even after the whole neighborhood got gentrified and all the old remnants of the 90s were torn down. It wasn't long after that, maybe around 1999, that the whole outdoor movie cafe trend completely crashed anyway. Hong Kong movies stopped being as popular, and cheap Chinese TVs started flooding the market, so everyone could finally afford to watch movies at home without having to sit on the sidewalk. The business model just died out. The physical landscape of the city has shifted so much that you wouldn't even be able to find where that foul-smelling alley used to be. The slaughterhouse is gone, and the outdoor movie cafes went out of business decades ago. That neighborhood looks completely unrecognizable now, effectively burying the grimy history under a fresh coat of paint and some new concrete. But physical changes don't just magically banish spiritual rot. He died in the dirt, trapped in a miserable loop of his own toxic habits, and I honestly think his energy is permanently anchored to that specific GPS coordinate. It leaves this horrible pit in my stomach, knowing that some poor, overworked teenager walking home tonight through a modern, brightly lit intersection might suddenly smell sour alcohol and hear someone right next to their ear asking for a coffee that hasn't been brewed in 30 years.